Alright guys, I got something cool to show you today. So, a couple years ago I did the Arisaka Type 99 review, where we looked at the Arisaka Type 99, put a couple rounds through it, sort of looked at how well it shot, and went over some of the history of it. I told you guys I would go back and try to find a last-ditch or a late war Type 99 and kind of compare the two. Well, a couple weeks ago I bought a last-ditch Type 99, and I'm pretty pleased with it, so I just kind of wanted to show you the differences. Now, the idea that there were last-ditch rifles is somewhat of a myth. The Japanese, when they went into production of these rifles, they produced them in different series, and the different series had different specifications. Some things were missing, some things were modified, changed. So the last-ditch rifles, really, it's kind of inaccurate to call them last-ditch rifles. They were late war rifles, which means it was series 34 through 35, where, you know, Japan was running low on scarce resources such as metal and wood, and so some of those components that were necessary for production were kind of stripped away and put into other parts of the war effort. So that's kind of cool. And some other neat things about the Type 99s in general is that, yeah, you had 8 or 9 different production arsenals, and you had different series. And like I was saying earlier, different series had things concerning butt plates, concerning how much wood, the quality of the metal. You know, do you need a rear sight adjuster? So there's kind of different things, but it wasn't just like last-ditch rifles were kind of thrown together last minute in these small factories. I mean, they were built to be operable and they were built to fire. In fact, the reason they're called last-ditch rifles was kind of this term that American servicemen gave them after the war, because they would put Type 38 rounds in the Type 99 last-ditch rifles, which shot a 7.7, and since these rounds are not interchangeable with these guns, they would fire and blow up the receiver and injure the soldier, and so they got this kind of this bad reputation for not being very good rifles, where in fact they're actually pretty decent rifles. So I'm going to actually take you through each section of the rifle and show you kind of the differences. Now, the last-ditch that I have, or the late war that I have, is a series 34 through 35, I believe. And so prior to that, you had the early war productions, the series 30 through 32s. These pretty much had all your standard factory parts that the guns were originally built with. You had the Series 33, which was considered the transition production rifle, and these were built in about 1944. This is when Japan still had supplies that were needed, or they still had these supplies around where they could build most of the components of the rifle, but this is when they started taking away those non-necessary components. And then the late war rifles, the 34 and the 35 series, is where you actually have some pretty considerable takeaway from parts. And so I'm going to take you through each part and kind of analyze them. So the first thing we're going to look at is the receivers for the late war production right here on the left, and the early war production here on the right. So the first thing you notice is that the early war production still has the dust cover on the bolt. You know, that takes up a lot of metal. It's not really necessary, so we're going to get rid of it, right? And the other thing we see is that on both of them, the chrysanthemums have been scratched off, and that's pretty typical. After the war, the Japanese military scratched the chrysanthemums off because it was dishonorable to give a weapon that was, you know, symbolically owned by the Emperor of Japan away to an American, so they were scratched off. So that's pretty normal for both of them. Another difference is that on the, you can see here on the early war production, you can see Type 99 symbols right here, roughly translated, on the early war production. But on the late war production, you don't see that at all. There is no Type 99, no writings at all. The other thing too is the receivers. The early war production is in a better shape. It's more clear. It's cleaner. It looked like it was tooled a little bit better, but that doesn't make the late war production any less operable or any less safe. Like I said, these are all means tested, and they were all there was no compromise in its operability. The other thing too is the sights. Now this is really interesting. On the sights right here, all you have is basically this little peephole on the rear sights. You didn't have on the early war production, you had the airplane caliper leads right here, which you were theoretically supposed to be able to get a shot off on a low-flying biplane. That wasn't necessary for its operation. And then the adjustable sights too, where you could move them back and forward, wasn't really necessary on the late war production rifles either. So that is a pretty noticeable thing there too. Is just the quality of the metal in general is different. Like I said, the early war production is just a little bit cleaner and more well tooled. The other thing that's interesting too is you look at so the bolts on both of these look the same. Now on some, like I said, there were different series, so I'm thinking this is more of a late series rifle, because both of the bolts you have the round heads. Now on some of the late war production rifles, these weren't round and smooth, they were just like chunks of metal, and they weren't tooled or smoothed out or anything. So yeah, like I said, not all what people would call last ditch or early or late war productions were all the same. They were all very different depending on what series they were made in and what factory they were made in. But again, they were all operable. Okay, so if you take a look at this is the early war production right here. You can see the bolt and safety knob right here. This is finely machined. It's got the basically the generic symbol, kind of this chrysanthemum sort of symbol on the back, just cosmetics really. And then the late war, they didn't even care about that at all. They just kind of smacked it together, tested it, and threw it on the battlefield. Like I said, in the early 1945, late 1945, I think this is probably a late 1944 or early 1945, they were not worried about making anything look good. They just wanted to get it out of the production facilities as quickly as possible and onto the battlefield. Now, the other thing we wanted to look at was the buttstocks. Now, the early war production, you have the strap holders right here, and then you have the standard metal butt plate right here. Now, on the late war production, they were running low on metal, so to conserve metal, they just would slap a piece of wood on the back of this, and then slam one or two nails in the back. Now, the one that I picked up does not have the wooden butt plate alternative that you would see on last ditch or late war rifles, and I'm guessing because wood doesn't last long, it got knocked out or lost. It looks like there's a little bit of termite damage right there, but you can see the two holes where that wooden slab would have been stuck in there. So it's kind of interesting. It certainly wouldn't be comfortable by any means. So one of the things that we wanted to look at as well was the stock and the front sights. So as you can tell on the early war production right here, the early war production up here, the front handguard is still there, and on the late war production, it's gone. It wasn't considered necessary. You can use the wood for something else. A Japanese soldier is going to be trained and disciplined enough not to burn his hand on that. The other thing too is if you look at the sights, the early war production has the two wings on the side, and this one doesn't. It's just a little knob sticking out, and it wasn't considered necessary. I mean, when they stripped down these late war production rifles for every material they could, they really stripped them down. Other thing that's interesting too are this one here has the cleaning rod that goes down below here and back into the rifle. This one doesn't even have the late war production doesn't even have a spot for a cleaning rod, which is interesting. I'm not sure why that is. I guess it wasn't considered necessary. So yeah, those are basically all the differences. There's a few minor things, like I was saying, such as like the extractor sizes. The early war production had chrome lining, and the late war production did not have the chrome lining, which means it's not as well preserved now. But other than that, they're both fun rifles. I really want to take the late war production out and shoot it at the range, which I might do in a couple weeks. I recently picked up some ammo for it, so I'm excited to do that, and I'll upload the video of me doing that at some point. But yeah, pretty awesome guns, and I enjoy telling the stories about them. So go hit the like button, comment if you have any questions, or if I left anything out. Thanks, guys.